Welcome everybody to the So by popular demand, I'm not allowed telling jokes anymore, so I'm just gonna do, I'm gonna do the housekeeping stuff. My name's Mike, I'm your session facilitator. Just the housekeeping stuff today, or right now, is that we have the keynote starting at 2, so there's one more session after this. There's also a 45-minute break after this. I think maybe you can zip down to the expo hall and pick up a pair of socks. There are speaker evaluation forms in your app so that you guys can judge Lester here on his performance. You can't judge me on my performance, thankfully. And there is a reception in the expo hall at 5 p.m. Until 6:30 p.m. Now, it doesn't say it here, but I'm pretty sure there'll be free beer, free drinks. So with that, I'm going to bring up Lester, and he's going to talk to us about the evolving landscape of security operations in government.
Great. Thank you. So I work in government, so I'm used to being judged. But with that being said, please, I'm a poor government employee, so please judge me really. So good morning, everybody. My name is Lester Godsey. I'm the Chief Information Security and Privacy Officer for Maricopa County. And so before I came on stage, I was talking to our facilitator, and he's like, oh, I've heard of Maricopa County. Of course you have. Everybody has. So by show of hands, how many of you have heard of Maricopa County? And how many of you like to see sausage made, and that's why you're at this presentation? Okay, fair enough. And for those of you who raised your hand the second time, I appreciate your honesty. So joking aside, Maricopa County has been in the epicenter of misdis and malinformation. We will be talking about that, not directly, but what I'll be focused on is talking about how our security operations role within Maricopa County has had to change as a result of the changing landscape from a technology perspective, as well as societal trends and just misdis and malinformation, as well as where we're finding our sources of intelligence. It's, again, if you like to figure out how sausage is made, you're in the right talk. So why has our security operations organization had to change in the first place? It's fundamentally about, sounds kind of boring and blasé, but from a government perspective, it's very unique. So before I move on to the next slide, by show of hands, how many of you work either directly or indirectly for a government agency? Oh, wow. You already know how the sausage is made. Maybe you just like to see somebody else's sausage being made, right? Okay, fair enough. So in our case, it's fundamentally about risk. And so let me preface it by saying, giving you some facts here from Pew Research. So when this study actually began in '58, 3/4 of Americans trusted federal government to do the right thing almost always or most of the time. AKA, those are the good days, good old days, right? So since 2007, the majority, or the percentage of people that say that they trust the government always or most of the time has never exceeded 30%. Talk about a big difference, right? And so I can tell you from personal experience being in local government, that percentage is about right, if not actually generous. So additionally, another study had shown that 71% of Americans get their news content, news specifically, from social media. That is disturbing, and maybe I'm showing my age here, right? But you know, when I think of news, I think of things like an industry framework, a standard by which news is actually defined and shared, right? So if you go to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University, there's an actual program and study around journalism, things that you should do, things you shouldn't do as a journalist. However, we as Americans, and I'm sure this exists across all countries in the world, that these social media platforms don't have the mechanism in place to ensure that what's being shared on social media platforms is actually considered news, right? Let's just be honest. The model itself is such that it doesn't value authenticity. I didn't do that, by the way. It doesn't value authenticity or accuracy of data. It just values the number of clicks. So,
we got you.
all right. Well, if you don't, nobody does, so I could take it from here, that's fine. Oh, nope, that's not my presentation. So I imagine at some point later this morning that somebody's going to post on social media that there was some sort of conspiracy with my presentation, by the way. So anyways, so basically the truth is not a litmus for what gets posted on social media. And unfortunately what we've experienced, and I think a majority of you as being government affiliated individuals, that citizens these days determine their own truth. And what they consume based off of these models only reinforces what their belief structure is, as opposed to challenging that belief structure in a more open and transparent or objective manner. So, so services are things that the government has traditionally done that have been historically trustworthy, have been called into question the last couple of years. The two in particular that come to mind from my perspective is public health and so, for example, when the pandemic was in its kind of at its peak, if you will, we were contending with a lot of dis, and malinformation around vaccine legitimacy, efficacy, origin, if you will, but then also, we also saw a lot of attempted crimes of opportunity, right? So at one point, we were tracking the number of phishing emails that the organization was getting that was COVID related, for example, right? Or targeting our public health or our correctional health departments, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then obviously the big elephant in the room is misdis and malinformation on social media has completely changed how my security operations function at Maricopa County works and what they have to contend with. So I'll give you a couple of examples along these lines, and this is where the sausage making gets into place. So kinetic or physical threats. So what we've seen are calls to take on positions in election departments. So for those of you who are not familiar with how local government typically operates, oftentimes it's very seasonal, like your parks and rec departments, right? Where during the summer in Arizona, we hire, cities hire a bunch of lifeguards, for example, right? We do the same from an elections perspective. So we hire a bunch of part-time employees, and then we also have a slew of volunteers that help us run our hundreds of different polling locations and get us over the hump in terms of the bigger elections, if you will. So one of the things that my security operations team has been doing for years now, so not recently, but I would say at least the last 4 years, has been monitoring social media, publicly accessible platforms to look for potential kinetic and or cyber threats against Maricopa County. This last election cycle, so the 2022 election cycle, we saw calls on social media basically responding to posts from our recorders department saying, hey, we're looking for volunteers and part-time employees. A number of these reposts, retweets, basically said, hey, let's get the right people in the recorder's office and to keep tabs on what they're doing to make sure that they're being honest, right? Now, with that legit, there's nothing illegal about it. Matter of fact, our recorder's office encouraged people who question the validity and the process by which voting gets tabulated and processed to volunteer so they could see how the sausage is made as well too, right? But at the same time, from our perspective, we can't ignore those sort of calls knowing that there's a potential of insider threat to the organization. And unfortunately, we were right in that people who were onboarded, a number of them were purposely disruptive, were purposely trying to influence in a negative fashion the process by which we were going to go through and validate votes, et cetera, et cetera. So the next thing we've seen, and I'll provide a tangible example here, is we've seen social media used not as a platform for coordination. So, so in the image on the your right-hand side, for those of you who are unaware of this, in the last election cycle, the 2022 election, we actually saw people in full tactical gear and automatic 2 ballot drop box locations. So Arizona has been a mail-in ballot state for decades, I think. And so my SecOps team, again, publicly accessible social media platforms, were able to, I didn't do that again. So they stumbled across on social media that there were groups planning on basically staking out these 2 particular locations. We were able to catch wind of that beforehand, before they actually started their cycle. They were using social media to coordinate who was going to do what when. And so they were basically doing it from a logistics perspective. So we were able to notify the appropriate parties along those lines, local law enforcement. We have a very mature incident response program where we let local law enforcement, if it impacts us, we let our state fusion center know, et cetera, et cetera. But we were able to determine not only where they were going to be located, but what wasn't commonly shared in the news was that in addition to staking those locations out, they also taking pictures of people's license plates for those that were dropping off ballots, and in some instances actually following vehicles that had dropped off ballots to see where they were going back to. Because the premise was they were functioning as ballot mules, which depending on the use case is illegal, right? So we were able to notify the appropriate departments along those lines and to mitigate any potential physical or kinetic risks that might occur as a result of that. So, and this last example, interstate issues requiring DHS involvement, that was a situation where my ops team was able to see on Telegram that there was some chatter about trying to take some tangible actions against a government agency in Hawaii, actually, from an elections voting perspective. And so we followed our protocol, and then we were able to notify the appropriate entities who then communicated with those agencies in Hawaii along those lines. So what all this has to do, has in common is my ops team was the one who basically was on top of all this and was able to use other media platforms to see where potential kinetic risks were. So insider threats, I've already talked a little bit about this. And so really, at the end of the day, what we've determined, unfortunately, is, at least for local government, Maricopa County in particular, there has been a heightened level of insider threat. And so there's some examples that, unfortunately, I can't share with you that involve internal employees. You know, you might have noticed that so far in this presentation, I have not once made reference to a political party or belief, right? That's not my position. Everybody has the right to, you know, believe what they want, say what they want, be affiliated with a political party of their choosing, et cetera, et cetera. It's not our place. We're explicitly told in our capacity as government employees from a local government perspective, we can't shill for one belief or one party or another, right? That's just not our position. But everybody has their own belief structure. As you can imagine, we have employees who feel very strongly about one party or one belief as opposed to another, which is fine. But then what we've seen evidence of is they take that and then they try to cause the county an inability or to reduce our efficacy in terms of the services that we're trying to provide, whether it's public health, elections, et cetera, et cetera. So we've had to take steps along those lines accordingly. So third example from a security operations perspective is obviously there's plenty of cyber threats out there, tend to be more in the form of mis, dis, and malinformation, although we've seen plenty of traditional cybersecurity attacks. We probably won't have time for it, but if you have, you can always, we're gonna save some time for questions, but the number of attacks and the things that we've seen really, I don't have a ton of time to get into, but we can talk offline about. But some examples I did want to share with you are In the 2020 election cycle, we saw this image that you can see on the right here posted. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this clear room is where our Dominion equipment is. It's air-gapped, it's not connected to our enterprise network. And on top of that, there's streaming 24/7 just in efforts to be transparent with regards to what's going on or what might not be going on in that room, right? And so this image started trending on social media. And you'll notice that little piece of paper, right, which we've kind of blown out here. So somebody manipulated this image to basically have a little piece of paper that says router login and password on it, right? And so we were able to use third-party software to demonstrate that this was doctored image, et cetera, et cetera. But we've also already seen deep fake videos as well used against us. Now, fortunately, at least at this point, not that I'm encouraging anybody in the audience to try to one-up the bad guys, but they've all been pretty crappy. And so not very good, not very believable. But it's only a matter of time, right? The technology is improving, things of that sort. But we've already seen it. We've already seen photo manipulation. We've seen deep fakes. We've also seen parody accounts as well. So we've had employees whose social media presence has been taken over or hijacked with parody accounts as well, and then them posting never post as a result. So, and then really at the end of the day, we're seeing distortion of trust in Maricopa County. And then lastly, denial of operational services. So a lot of the attacks that we've seen from a cybersecurity perspective are your traditional flavor DDoS attack or some sort of related attack that may have a detrimental impact on us. And the interesting thing about that is, you know, the denial of service attacks don't have to be super effective. They don't have to last for days or even hours, right? Just the simple fact of disrupting our operations, whether through cyber means and or reputational checks, just need to be good enough to cast that seed of doubt within our ability, within our organization, right? And so I'm sure a lot of you are experiencing similar things as well. So what's this all mean from a security operations perspective? Social media platforms are a threat vector, plain and simple. They're also used for logistics and planning. And from an operational perspective, we're of the belief that ignoring social media is frankly no different scanning for vulnerabilities, unfortunately. So this is something that traditional SecOps teams haven't had to deal with, especially in government, right? And so we're already short-staffed. We already have an inability to hire and retain employees because folks like Google, you know, keep on stealing them away from us, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the new reality. I would argue you don't have to be in the limelight like Maricopa County to experience this, and I suspect a lot of you in the audience are already experiencing something to this effect. So, necessity is the mother of all invention, AKA, how are we handling this? So we're doing our traditional web and physical security assessments. A lot of what we're doing is honestly process-based assessments as well. What's our workflow? What's our business process? As a result of that, how can we mitigate risk before it actually becomes a potential risk or incident, as the case might be? Also, from an organizational perspective, what are our risk tolerance? What's our risk threshold? How are we asset risk, right? And then supply chain assessment. This one's interesting too. So I will tell you in the 2020 election cycle or leading up to it, we actually got hit with vendor compromise, if you will. So there's a very popular third-party hosted service that's designed specifically for government agencies to bring residents and other folks together on a common platform, you know, that sort of thing, and collaborate. And so it's one that Maricopa County uses, as well as a majority of local government agencies throughout the country. We saw a report from a fusion center on the East Coast that had basically said, hey, there's an inordinate number of accounts being created and registered on this platform. And so per our internal protocol, we look at the assets. Yes, that's a service that we subscribe to and we use. And then we worked with that vendor and local law enforcement, and we're able to determine with a high degree of confidence, local government shouldn't be, that should be coming from the federal government. Even if we're right, that doesn't mean we have the resources, nor are we responsible for doing attribution of nation state attacks. But I will tell you that that was a situation where, in that instance, it was a supply chain vendor issue with a third party vendor, and that we have a high degree of confidence based off of the 3-letter agencies we were participating with, that there was a nation state attack that was automated, that was auto-registering using bots, these accounts, and we are of the belief that they were being auto-created for purposes of trying to influence public sentiment. So we saw that in 2020. Social media efforts, VIP reports, and so this is where maybe Maricopa County might be slightly different than a lot of other local government agencies. Just to be honest, after a certain point where not only your elected officials, but people who are underpaid and undervalued to begin with are getting death threats, you got to do something along those lines. And so we maintain, and it fluctuates, of VIPs. And that's not just our elected officials, but people who are being targeted on various different media platforms. And we try to keep tabs to the best of our ability about what's being said. We actually had somebody who's no longer working for Maricopa County because frankly, they just didn't want to deal with it, and I don't blame them in the slightest. Fortunately, they weren't home, but their personal information, they got doxxed on social media, and their personal residence got leaked online, and then there was a group of armed individuals banging on their door at like 2 in the morning or something like that. Fortunately, she wasn't there, but she captured the whole thing through a ring video. Right? And so that's the kind of VIP stuff that we're talking about. So we should actually, instead of VIP, we should call it VTP, very targeted people, right? But unfortunately, that's our VIP list. We also provide, to the best of our ability, an exposure analysis reporting. So we do daily intelligence briefs that we share across all 50 plus departments in Maricopa County. On a weekly basis, we summarize that information and share that with the chiefs of staff or our board of supervisors and county management. Part of that reporting is exposure or our media sentiment. So what's trending on social media, who's saying what's getting traction along those lines. And the reason why we do that is because we know the more eyeballs on something, the greater the likelihood of cyber and or kinetic threat occurring against the organization or individuals, as the case might be. So we talked about social media sentiment monitoring, and then social media lockdown. So we offer bespoke custom training on how to safely set up social media accounts and use them online. Unfortunately, we've had to do that as a result of tangible threats against the organization. So we had one individual, for example, who's working for our recorder's office. Her public, I think it was Facebook, her public Facebook account had the image that she used had a picture of her family in the background. And so one of the threats that she received was something to the effect of, not only you, but your husband and your 2 kids better make sure they are watching where they are. And so between some of the impersonation attacks and things of that sort, we've had to go to this level of down and assisting employees and offering training along those lines. Organizational preparedness. So we've had to deal with hostile journalism, or journalism in quotes, right? True journalists, I think, adhere to certain ethical and professional standard. Not everybody does that. We've had to deal with organizations that claim to be news outlets or journalists, which is questionable at best. So how do we deal with that? Social media safety, I've already referred to. Red team drills. One thing I would encourage all organizations, whether you're in government or not, this ship with regards to mis, dis, and malinformation, and I'll talk a little bit more about this here in a second, that ship has sailed. And so this is something that we practice, mature organizations will practice for things like ransomware attacks or DDoS attacks or compromised credentials or whatever the case is. How many of you practice for insider threats? How many of you practice for social media-based attacks, things of that sort? Certainly, we've had to create those playbooks ourselves, and we do practice those on a regular basis. So, and then stakeholder attestations, and so, and again, this is more in response to trying to build credibility and maintain a reputation that we're objective and above board in what it is that we try to do. So whether it's through third party, typically it's through third parties, whether we're talking about our enterprise network, our election system, security system reviews, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I've talked a little bit about this. So your partner ecosystem is very important. And so tabletop exercises. So in preparation for the 2022 election cycle, I guess I'll give them a shout out. We brought Mandiant in to facilitate an insider threat tabletop exercise that involves the recorder's office, my team, the Secretary of State's, CISO at the time, our federal partners, et cetera, just to prepare on what we would do and where our gaps were if there was an insider threat along those lines. We obviously do red team exercises, my exercises once a month across a myriad of different examples. So I've already alluded to this. So we have a coordination between state, local, and federal partners along those lines. And we also do, and I don't have time unfortunately, but we do have automated intelligence sharing from IOCs. We ingest those and we automatically share them to partners that we trust as well. So you might be asking yourself, why is SecOps stuck dealing with a majority of this, right? And so don't they just watch the wall? Aren't they just hands on keyboard type of folks? Yeah, they do that. But unfortunately, mother is a necessity of all invention. So we've had to come up with ways to respond to new threats that we've never had to deal with. I've been in public service for 27 years now, and this is just uncharted territory from a cybersecurity perspective. Why don't we outsource this, and how do we justify this? So honestly, we just need to get as much out of the team as possible. And so also, we want to keep people dumb enough to want to work in local government and not get paid, engaged, right? And so we wanted to expand their skill set. So it was killing two birds with one stone. We do internal pen testing, we do internal red teaming, we do tabletop exercises as a service. These are all part of our service catalog for our InfoSec program. And our ops team does this. So this expands their skill sets and makes them more marketable. It frankly engages them as opposed to just getting numbingly bored just by looking at a monitor, right? We needed to make that more professionally engaging, and we had an organizational need along those lines. We do outsource, but we outsource the mind-numbing stuff. So they're not on call 24/7. We frankly can't pay them enough to make them want to do that 24/7. From a social media monitoring perspective, to my knowledge, no offense against any vendor that might be in the room, but if you exist and do what it is that we need you to do, I'm unaware of you. And so that's the kind of stuff we need to maintain in-house. And again, the last bullet, same thing, apologies in advance if you're a vendor and you claim you can do this. We haven't found a solution that will use our AI to automatically, collate, ingest, and then parse out usable intelligence based off of social media that we can legitimately follow. And our justification, frankly, is risk. Threats of harm and violence against the organization. Reputation is critical for government. So I began the presentation by showing how little people trust. Now that research was the federal government specifically, but I'm assuming that trend applies to us in local government. Trust is the basis by which we're either successful or not in meeting the needs of our constituents. So anything that we can do to help improve the trust that our constituents have in us, we're going to do as an organization. So, and then obviously there's ongoing cyber risks and operational impacts. So from a justification perspective, we're good to go. I think we've made a very solid business case. So if I had a crystal ball for 2024, I was telling my handler here that I will be retiring from government service at the end of 2024. I'm actually eligible, but I committed to my team I would help them see through the next presidential election cycle, because frankly, that's the least I could do. So, but we're going to see more of the same. We're going to see more nation-state attacks. We saw impacts from the Russian-Ukraine war, frankly, at Maricopa County. I could tell you offline about that. We're going to see more ATPs, hacktivists, and a combination of cyber and kinetic events. But guarantee we're going to see even more impact of social media platforms via misdis and malinformation. So the second biggest risk, we're going to see more kinetic or physical threats. We've already seen doxing attempts. We've already seen folks hostily approached, whether they're elected officials or staff, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, it's a presidential election. So based off of 2020, it's going to be quite the experience. Well, I couldn't think of a polite, professional way of describing it. So if I had to bet again, we're going to see better deepfake videos. We're going to see more prevalence of AI machine learning based attacks against us. Again, I think we're already seeing that, but the phishing quality, for example, launched against Maricopa County is improving significantly. I can only assume that they're using ChatGPT or other types of technology to help deliver a better phishing campaign, if you will. And we're going to see increased threats against of an insider nature. So how can we keep up? You know, we have to be realistic about what we can do and what we can't do. We have to use risk as that litmus, and then apply the limited resources we have in terms of where we think the biggest bang for buck is going to be. So, and then we just need to coordinate and we need to communicate better. So we have lots of experience in Arizona, Maricopa County in particular. We just completed a successful Super Bowl. And then in terms of elections specifically, in the last election cycle was the first time that all 15 counties coordinated day of in terms of what they were seeing. We'll obviously continue that as well. And again, so I'm just kind of going through this real quick because I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but about the impact of social media and media platforms from a cybersecurity and kinetic risk perspective. If you care about reputation and brand, then you have a stake in social media. It's ultimately about risk, but it's basically how you define it. So in summary, between advancing technologies, a fractured society, there's new and existing but maturing threats facing government. These threats are already taxing a sector that has limited resources when it comes to cybersecurity. Embracing the basics, so you have to eat your vegetables from a cybersecurity perspective, but if you can do that and find creative solutions to address these new threats, then you'll be on the right path. And again, lastly, while this focus of the talk was specifically on government, this is something that all sectors should care about. So, and there's my contact info.
Excellent. Thank you, Lester. Well, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Anyone have any questions?
Thanks. Great presentation. You mentioned cooperation with other state agencies. And where has that worked, and where do you think you need improvement with coordination of those?
Yeah. So keep in mind, this is specifically from my perspective. I will tell that in the 2020 election cycle, that's been the best coordination with the federal government that I've ever seen in my career. And not to dog on the feds that are in the room, but prior to that, the communication was typically one way. We'd feed stuff up. We'd never hear stuff coming down. In the 2020 election, from my perspective, was the first time we received substantial, incredible threats coming the other way that we were able to action on. So that was fantastic. I do think more of that needs to occur. I also do think, and the Super Bowl was a good example of this, where I won't go into the details because I can't, but the week leading up to the Super Bowl, the last Super Bowl in Phoenix, was a good example of how the sectors need to talk. So not just government to government, but government and other sectors. So we saw that the NFL and all the local governments in Arizona were being targeted by the same cyber attack. And so if we hadn't had that forum in place where the entertainment or sports sector and government weren't talking to one another, we would have never seen that correlation, right? And so I will say one NFL team did get successfully popped, but I won't mention who it was. So anyways, so that's where I think that needs to improve.
Great presentation. How do you eliminate a lot of the noise and the false positives, or the true positives? How do you go after them on social media because there's so much noise?
Yeah, great question. And I'm going to put a different spin on the question. We're a government agency. So when I signed employment with Maricopa County, I signed a form that said I'd protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. That includes the right to free speech. So we have to be very careful about how we come across on social media where we're not trying to censor somebody, right? And so now, so with that being said, unfortunately, it's kind of needle in the haystack approach. So we have very defined criteria with regards to what is credible versus what isn't. And so we've gotten pretty good at manually, and we're constantly looking at technology to improve that, of just people venting and saying what they think of government. They're allowed to do that, but B, it doesn't add any material impact versus things like that are more tangible. So the things we look for are the logistics, right? Like the planning aspect. Another example of that is during the 2020 election cycle, we saw a group on social media trying to use that platform to coordinate a caravan to follow election staff when they were traveling between voting sites. So that would be credible. Or we look for keywords and things of that sort. Part of the reason why we look for keywords is the federal government is limited in what they can do from a prosecutorial perspective, right? So unless somebody on social media says, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to cause you harm, or something that's blunt and blatant, they really can't do anything from a legal perspective, right? So that kind of also becomes our threshold as well. But it is unfortunately kind of more of a needle in the haystack approach, but yeah.
So I'd like to follow up on that first question. Can you speak a little bit more about the venues, the boards, the processes you use to share information with government and to receive federal government, and or across similar state entities? I'm thinking of things such as the ISACs, right? You mentioned one, DHS fusion centers, and or sort of any sort of bespoke things you might have.
Yeah, great question. So it really depends on the event and the issue at hand. So our internal protocol is just on a daily basis. When we see a credible threat, we have a distinct process where we parse out and create the IOC. We automate the sending of that to the State of Arizona's Department of Homeland Security, which that's the department that cybersecurity resides in at the state level. So we automate the IOC going that way. We also have a process and a form by which we report to our fusion center, which is the ACTIC, Arizona Counterterrorism Intelligence Center is what it's called. And that's a daily basis. But then when it comes to unique things like Super Bowl, or let's just say elections, we have an incident response playbook specifically designed just around election security. And so leading up to and day of election and then post, because you still are tabulating votes, we have a more bespoke approach. So we do internal reporting every 2 hours of what we're seeing based off of network, email, endpoint, social media. We kind of color code it so to make it executive friendly with regards to where the potential threats are. We will call out specific examples. We'll put that in the report. That report goes to internal departments, but then that goes to the ACTIC, also goes to the Secretary of State's security folks, It also goes to FBI, DHS, et cetera, et cetera. And so that occurs it used to be every hour, and we scaled that back to every 2 hours. If there was a credible or tangible threat, we have an internal process where we'd communicate that with the Fusion Center, but based off of feedback from our federal partners, we'll contact them directly as well. And then lastly, at a higher level, all the counties from an election perspective, like I mentioned in the slide, starting in 2022, they have their own internal protocols of what they're seeing from an election perspective and where the risks are. So for example, in the last election, one of the smaller counties, Pinal County, they had a ballot printing issue. They ran out of ballots actually. And so that was something that they shared proactively. So that way the other counties could be prepared to respond to that if necessary. So it really depends on the situation, but in the case of elections, it's all hands on deck and it's very custom bespoke with regards to our incident response, our playbook, our communication, et cetera, et cetera. So.
When it comes to mis, dis, and malinformation, do you have any education or training programs to try to inoculate people so that they're less susceptible to believing these false headlines?
Yeah, so we use both our vendor supplied training materials, which if I'm being honest, and I won't mention who it is, it's kind of meh, you know? And so in a lot of instances, a lot of that comes from us. And so whether it's just internal training on how to do social media account lockdown, like I mentioned, but also, we're coming up to the Cybersecurity Awareness Month, right, in October. We offer kind of lunch and learns along those lines. We encourage people and we offer training to think critically. And again, it's not our position to tell our own employees, let alone our constituents, what to think or what to believe, but rather we take the approach of, see on social media, have you validated that with a trustworthy source? Are the sources of information that you typically go to credible? How do you define credibility along those lines, right? So I might be showing my age, but who am I kidding? I am showing my age. But I miss the good old days of just newspapers pre-social media, because at least the credible newspapers or publications out there you knew were following some sort of universal standard of credibility. And they actually cared about truth and accuracy as opposed to click rates. So, yeah.
Thank you for the presentation, sir. Sir, with all of these response plans and response teams, it sounds like you have a very effective but resource-intensive operation. How would you scale that or advise a county that was, say, half the size of yours to achieve a comparable level of security or confidence as yours? Or even if you had double the budget and double the resources, what would you do to improve further than you currently can operate?
Yeah, great question. And so, truth of the matter is, Maricopa County, by population, we're the 4th largest county in the United States. And so, my security team, frankly, very blessed to have the size and the quality team I do. So what I would tell other organizations, other counties or local government agencies with limited or just a fraction of those resources, do an assessment of where your real risk is from an organizational perspective. Honestly, social media might be less of an issue for your organization than it is for Maricopa County, right? And so if that's the case, put your limited money and resources where they're best applied. Another thing I would encourage organizations to do, and even Maricopa County, when it comes, especially during the election cycles, we have to hit up other teams in our IT organization to help, right? So monitoring of our network edge, monitoring of endpoints, monitoring of email and other threat vectors within our organization, we ask other teams to assist us. We're centrally responsible for that, coalescing and then inferring what's actionable and what's not, but we ask those teams to help. In the smaller organizations, you're even more dependent on that. And I've worked for very small local governments before, so I can speak from firsthand experience. The other thing I would encourage is identify what services are commodity-based that you might be able to outsource that. So like the monitoring of social media we do, I don't know of any third party that does it to the degree that we do. The incident response planning, et cetera, we have to do that in-house. But the other stuff we can get rid of and outsource, like 24/7 SOC operations, we're absolutely doing that. So that's what I would encourage those organizations to do.
And with that, we have a 45-minute break. Expo is open. Next session is at 11:30. Thank you very much, Lester.